Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much to Cam Carey for having me here today to moderate this excellent panel. And folks in the back, we've got some empty seats that opened up. Please feel free to come up now or during, and we'll go ahead and get started. So first, I want to just very briefly introduce the experts that are here on the stage with me tonight. They're all far more expert than I am in these topics, and I'm very excited about it. You have their bios in a packet, though, so I won't go for too long, but just so you're aware, from my left, we have Danny Sepulveda, who is the VP for Global Government Relations, right, at MediaMath, a prominent demand-side platform, if that's accurate, advertising technology provider for online advertising primarily. And prior to that, of course, he has 2 decades in prominent public service, which you can read about. To Danny's left, we have Sheila Cole-Glacier, the SVP Global Chief Data Ethics Officer and Public Policy. Hopefully I'm getting that right. Sheila directs the Enterprise Data Governance, Data Protection, and Privacy Program for LiveRamp, which we'll also talk about. To her left, we have Tim Sparapani. Tim launched SPQR Strategies. He's the founder of SPQR Strategies, prior to which he was the first director of public policy at Facebook. And to his left, all the way on the end, we have Justin Brookman. Very excited to have Justin here. Justin has a long history in consumer advocacy and privacy advocacy in civil society, and is currently, how long, Justin, into your new role at Consumer Reports?
Year plus.
A year plus as the Director of Consumer Privacy and Technology Policy at Consumer Reports, which has been increasingly active in the privacy and security space here in DC. So I'm going to recommend that we not retread some of the ground that was really excellently covered on the first panel. I think they got into some of the differing approaches of US privacy law and the GDPR, some of the failings of notice and choice, some of the risks posed by the rise of new and emerging technologies, and that I think has all been well covered. But what we've been asked to talk about here today is specifically advertising technology. Advertising technology and the closely associated world of data brokers, which I understand even by itself can be a contentious term. And so to start out, I just want to acknowledge that these are the 2 fields that, from my perspective at Future Privacy Forum, are some of the least understood in the entire consumer privacy debates that we see day to day. Not only are these, I think, some of the least understood industries, but they are also the industries that tend to be a flashpoint for consumer advocates. There is just a tremendous amount of scrutiny and attention paid specifically to these 2 industries, and we'll talk about why and how much of that is accurate and correct. Just to level set for the audience on what it is we're actually talking about, I thought I would quote from the FTC's 2014 report on data brokers, in which they undertook an analysis of 9 data brokers and tried to characterize them and identify some of the risks associated with this field. And I'll add a little bit more to that because I think the field has also changed considerably since even 2014. There are 5 characteristics of data brokers when we're talking about what it is we're actually discussing that the FTC wrote about in 2014. The first is that these are companies that collect data from a variety of sources on consumers. We're going to be talking mostly about US consumers today, largely without their knowledge, although that may be changing. And these records may be related to things like voting registration, bankruptcy, purchases, often through loyalty programs, online web browsing activity, and many more things that you can get from commercially available or publicly available and often government records. The second characteristic is that this ecosystem, for lack of a better word, is very complex. Often we're talking about data brokers that are selling and reselling information to each other in ways that may not even touch the end user. The third is that as an industry, we're talking about a vast array of data collection covering nearly every US consumer, and I might say nearly every US individual. And these data sources are combined and analyzed together to often make inferences that are relevant to marketing and advertising. The fifth characteristic is that these sources can be both online and offline. And there is an increasing push towards technology that is able to combine online and offline sources. That's what the FTC said in 2014. I would add to that that in the last 5 years, we've seen a rise in intermediary platforms that specifically provide a service that I would call cross-device linkage, that is not necessarily augmenting consumer profiles at all, but simply providing the service of demonstrating that the person who owns this phone or tablet is the same person or family that owns this smart television or smartwatch or computer. And this is largely just driven by the number of devices that we all have today and the number of different platforms that we're all using to consume content. Within that field, we're going to talk about ad tech facilitators, and of course, just to anchor us in time, of course, it's June, it's 2019. The debates on federal legislation have reached their peak in all of the time that we've all been in, working in consumer privacy. We have seen 16 plus either discussion drafts from industry and civil society and introduced bills in Congress just in the last 6 months. So if you need some weekend reading, there's a lot out there in terms of different approaches that you can take to regulating consumer privacy in the United States. There's also, of course, a tremendous amount of state activity, including specifically, we might talk a little bit about the Vermont Data Broker Registry Bill, which came into effect this year and has led to a registration of data brokers operating in Vermont. So, with that level setting, we're going to leave some time at the end for questions, and the structure of this panel is that we're going to talk first about the current landscape. I'd like the panelists to help me describe that landscape, help me describe what the legitimate and good uses are in that landscape and what the risks are. Where are we? And then in the second 15 minutes or so, we will talk about what the different approaches are that we could take to regulating consumer privacy in the US that would specifically touch advertising and marketing. And then we'll take a bunch of questions. So let me start first with Tim. Tim, we've talked about this before, and I think you do an excellent job of explaining it. So I'll start and just ask, how is this industry, advertising, marketing, data brokers included, different now than it was 10 or 20 years ago? What's changed?
Yeah, so thank you, Stacy, for the question, and thank you for the Brookings Institution for the opportunity to speak. Let me go back to my roots, not at Facebook, but at the ACLU, where I led the privacy efforts. I'm going to make the argument today that this is the quintessential privacy problem of our day. It has been the quintessential privacy problem of the last 2 decades, and it remains completely unaddressed. Despite what you're reading in the papers about 4 or 5 Goliath companies out of Silicon Valley being the thing that bedevils our privacy, the real issue is that there is an enormous and completely unregulated industry that's been around for 40 years that is buying up data, selling it to whomever they want at all points. So the reason that Facebook got in so much trouble is because there was a company called Cambridge Analytica that was taking data and reselling it, okay? There are all sorts of other things that these companies have done which are loathsome, they're obnoxious, they should be regulated, but we should not lose sight of the fact that there is this industry that has been there for at least 40 years, which is buying and selling data. So let me tell you what's happened in at least the last 5 years. 5 years ago, I went on 60 Minutes and I railed about this problem. And I talked a lot about the fact that there were companies that were buying and selling data, and that you could buy data about anybody, any malady, anything that had happened that was terrible in their life, and it was being sold to anybody who wanted to buy it. What's happened since that moment is we've moved from a moment when we're just talking about list brokerage, companies buying and selling data to and from each other, and frankly to the governments around the world. And now we've got a moment when we've had an evolution in the practices, and now we're talking about scoring of each individual out there. So what has happened is that the companies, many of them in the marketing industry, many of them in the advertising industry, have taken this to the next level. They've taken the data they bought, and they have done predictive work on that data. And they have begun to make decisions about what goods and services they are going to offer each and every one of us, primarily online, but certainly when we go into stores as well. So first point, we've moved from list brokerage, and now we're on to predictive scoring. And those scores are largely, almost entirely unregulated. There's no transparency to them. We can talk about that in a little bit. Second point, this used to be a third-party problem. What I mean by that is companies which you did not interact with were getting data from companies you did interact with and they were selling it to everybody else. This was a third-party problem. So it used to be the case that we would probably go ahead and regulate those third parties that were gathering the data. We could go ahead and say, those companies should stop being able to buy and sell data because we had no interaction with them. What's happened since then is something really important. Most of the major retailers out there have actually sucked up and acquired at least one of these data broker companies. So they brought them in-house. So what used to be a third-party problem is now a first-party problem. And the question about how we define what a data broker has totally changed again, even before we got to the point of regulating. So we've lost the ability to sort of identify with precision that that's a data broker and that's not. We should regulate that company and we shouldn't regulate that company. Because virtually every retailer is now a data broker. And that's happened just in the last several years, and it's happening with increasing frequency. The third and final point, I think it's happened just in the last 5 years, and it's a really important transformation of this industry, is that we've moved towards a moment of almost ubiquity of this practice. It used to be that the best companies could buy brokerage lists, right? They could do the scoring and they could be in an advanced position in the marketplace because of their ability to obtain these advanced data services. This stuff is cheap, it is ubiquitous, it is everywhere, and it is, again, completely unregulated. So we are in a new era, and it is affecting every single thing we do online. So let's get after it.
So you gave some really good examples in the 60 Minutes report of specific brokerage lists that are available for purchase. Do you want to elaborate on a couple of those?
Yeah, if you've ever, maybe had a family member who's had an addiction problem, which is about 30 million Americans, there is absolutely a list sold about you and the member of your family who's had that addiction. Every single malady that you've ever had, they're selling that list. Every malady that your family members have had, somebody is selling a list about that. There were rape victim lists. Some of those have been removed now, but there were actually people selling victims of lists of people who were victimized by rape and other sexual assault. And I could go on and on and on. There is a list for everything, and now there is categorization of people into groupings based on all sorts of appearances and opinions about people's attitudes, so that you're being lumped into groups. So we've taken those maladies, those things that you can't control that maybe your family members have done, maybe they've had a bad moment, they've not been able to pay their bills, and now you're being lumped into those things, and those lists are being sold about you.
Thanks. I'd love to get Sheila's reaction. Tim, I think it was correct to point out that this is an industry that's been around for 40 plus years. Sheila, what's your reaction to this? Can you tell us a little bit about the history there? And do you agree that this field is totally unregulated?
Well, by way of background, my prior life was with Axiom Corp. Some of you may know. Certainly we were part of the FTC special order, the resulting 2014 report. So about 18% of Axiom's revenue is actually the collection and the cleaning and hygiene and producing a data product. And I can say, having worked for that company for a very long time, we didn't have any of those kinds of scurrilous lists. We ran a very careful, thoughtful program.
That's true.
We were a member of the Direct Marketing Association and were primary voices on the privacy promise to the American consumer. We did access to all of the data we use for fraud detection and prevention. And we made that data available for things like banks are required by law to know their customers. So we built those information tools very thoughtfully with an extraordinary amount of rigor for the products we produce for marketing and advertising purposes. We innovated a data provenance or a data origins process 15, 16 years ago, where not by contract, we actually would go and do due diligence, look at the origin of the data to determine where it came from, how it was collected, what notices were in place, how effective we thought or believed they were, what kind of consumer experience created the data. We then mapped it forward to use. We have or had, Axiom did and still does, a data classification program which maps into permissible uses. So we had a very layered and rigorous approach to ensuring that data was used ethically. And in fact, the program was called Ethical Data Use. And that company, which is truly, a portion of their business is data brokering, served large brands and small brands. And I think one of the points I want to make is that's, in my view, that's very old-fashioned stuff. It has been around for 40 years. And actually data, having a list available, like a small hardware store would go in and they would want to be able to find a mailing list. This is the olden days of homeowners in the area so they could promote. They sold roofing supplies in their store. The apartment dwellers probably wouldn't be as interested in re-roofing their apartment buildings, but homeowners would. So it was a way to create efficiency and control cost and reach out and connect with your audience. That's the olden days. In the future, of course, data has become infinite, right? Where we are today, data is a reality. It is way beyond big data. We live in a virtuous cycle. The smart devices that we all carry, our little mobile hip computers, as I like to call them, consume and create and consume and create. It's the way tech works. We are living in what's called the fourth industrial revolution, the digital age, also called the machine age. And the fuel of the machine age is data. So in my view, it's not, data is, technology is, and will continue to be. The big question is, how is it used? Data is one of the great democratizers, right? A market entrant who doesn't have the money, the resources, the savvy to compete with one of the big monoliths can have some data and effectively compete in the digital space, which is where all of us are living and consuming. Our consumer lives are now very digital, right? So I think it's a matter of competition, of fostering innovation, of free speech, that data does flow, it is available, but is accountable. And I think that's where the real debate is. We have to acknowledge the reality and the practicality of our economy, of jobs creation, of the need to ensure that America remains competitive into the digital future. So we have to figure out a way to grapple with the reality, but make sure our marketplace is trusted, that we have the right controls in place so that we can foster innovation and competition. And I think there's a way to do it. I would love a national standard that is accountability based, has all of these empowerment rights for people, and I think those are on a continuum. One example that bright lines that is for a fraud detection and prevention tool, I don't think you should allow opt-out. Having run a program that had those tools available, it was an everyday occurrence that a bad actor would try to opt out. We provided access and they would challenge the data, and we'd have to go through this rigorous research to determine if the data was real and true from its point of origin. But these choices are on a continuum, and I think it's what Amy said earlier. I don't know if she's still with us, but it's incredibly complex. It's not a one-size-fits-all. Data is really important, and its use and its value and its benefits and its potential harm or risk is highly contextualized, and we need a very thoughtful approach to how to get it right.
Awesome. Thanks, Sheila. And I definitely want to return to the topic of access rights and opt-outs a little bit later on when we talk about how the law addresses this. And it's true that Axiom, I think, is one of the prominent examples among data brokers, but both of generally better practices, but also specifically of your access tool, which, out of just curiosity, could I get a show of hands? Has anyone ever used the Axiom access tool where you put in your information and see what the marketing categories are?
It no longer exists.
Pretty
by the
good.
way. It's offline.
Yeah, it's offline, and I understand being redeveloped.
I'm not with Axiom anymore, so I don't run the program anymore, but my fabulous colleague Jordan Abbott does. And the reason, and I'll just share, and I think Jordan would be fine if I shared. They've removed it. The code was old and clunky, and they're innovating a new tool to get ready for CCPA. But Axiom's way ahead. Now, I'm with LiveRamp, and they are not a data broker. They are one of those linking or data connectivity companies. So we do this, I think it is a democratizer of the digital marketplace. We enable little companies, new companies, entrepreneurs, startups to enter the digital space and connect with the same power as the big monoliths. So I'm really proud of the capabilities that we've devised while operating a very rigorous, aggressive data governance approach.
So, Justin, let me get your reaction to that, because I think competition is at the heart of Consumer Reports' mission, and I know we've also heard this similar style of rhetoric. Data is democratizing in many contexts related to online advertising for many years. From a consumer advocate point of view, what's your reaction to that?
I mean, I've certainly heard this argument over time that privacy law only helps Google and Facebook, right? It's a very common refrain. I mean, it's not like Google and Facebook were doing badly before GDPR, right? I mean, like the Google-Facebook rise has been kind of incremental and gets passed and gets implemented. I think it's kind of silly to blame GDPR for doing that. I think Google and Facebook have viable business models outside of the data brokerness, right? So Google can still make a ton of money doing first-party contextual ads off of search. Facebook can still make a ton of money serving first-party ads that I think don't really violate context. To that extent, they're maybe better off, but Google and Facebook are the biggest recipients today of third-party data, right? And so I think to argue that it's in their interest is kind of silly. I think we do have an existing framework for dealing with third-party data, right? And it's the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And we say, there's no you can't opt out the Fair Credit Reporting Act. You can contest it. You can have you can argue that it's inaccurate. There are obligations, but we've said for these limited purposes like credit and employment and eligibility, we're going to allow people to break context. We're going to allow people to share data, and there's no rules around it. For other data, I don't know. I'm not convinced. I think you can make an argument that there isn't the justification for allowing a grocery store to just put in their privacy policy, we reserve the right to share information with data brokers. Then it goes to an Axiom, right? I think that breaks context. So I want to hear counter arguments to this, but I think there's an argument that data outside of, we don't need third-party data outside of the boundaries of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. Because I think when consumers do go from site to site or from store to store, there's a natural, again, we're talking about context of, this is what the premise of the Obama Privacy Bill of Rights, that kind of stays in that first party-ish relationship. And rather than force people through consent dialogues on every single site they go to or every store, make them fill out a form and what are your 20 privacy choices here, instead the law should accord data practices to that idea of context and to consumers' reasonable expectations.
So grounding data collection in context and reasonable expectations. Danny, do you want to argue against anything that Justin said, or what's your reaction to that in terms of?
I think you can add to that. Context and consumer expectations are clearly very important as key principles in the construction of any privacy law. And I've been through and watched multiple efforts to construct a general law of privacy for consumers. Justin mentioned the Obama efforts and the Obama administration, where Kim Carey was a key component of that. I was at state when we did that. I was the principal staffer on the Kerry-McCain bill, which I think is still the only bipartisan comprehensive privacy bill presented in the Senate. And I was on the Commerce Committee working for Barbara Boxer when Hollings moved a comprehensive privacy bill through the Commerce Committee. And I can tell you that in none of those contexts, and I don't believe in the GDPR either, has anyone said that third-party data should be illegal, that we should prohibit access to and use of third-party data. There are very good uses for third-party data in the ecosystem. The rise in value of first-party data has taken prominence, in large part because it is more likely to be true. It's directly observed, and it's more likely to be useful because you know who you're talking to. The utility of third-party data for marketers and in advertising is really for the expansion of reach. And there you're dealing with probability as opposed to certainty. Mm-hmm. And the goal with probability, you don't get the same sort of return, but you do have the ability to reach customers that are somewhat like the customers you know. or that you believe may be somewhat like the customers you know. And so the market has kind of worked out the differential pricing and all of that. I do think that the things that were discussed earlier and the things that Cam and his colleague raised in the paper that they produced today around stewardship and the obligations of anyone who accesses data, whether they be a third or a first party, should be consistent and they should be high. And that consumers should have a much greater degree of capacity to control how the market sees them.
When you talk about accessing data, can we bring it home to the point of data collection, for example?
Sure.
Just to take it back to Justin's point about reasonable expectations and context. I think it was the Times that just earlier this week purchased a list from a prominent data broker and contacted customers on that list. And even if you didn't see it, the basic point is upon contacting people on that list, most of them were surprised at the information that was available about them from various government and commercial sources. So it may not be surprising or outside of context or outside of expectations for, say, my grocery store to know what I've been purchasing. But the fact that that same information may be shared, sold, disclosed to third parties that use it to compile profiles, while a common feature of the status quo information sharing ecosystem today, can we make an argument that that's not surprising to most people, or out of context or unreasonable? Feel free, or
I'm happy.
Yeah,
we're
please.
We're not in that business. We're not a data broker. Although we do, for the purposes for our marketers and our clients, we will access some third-party pools of data. I think we access information from Axiom and from Oracle and from some of the others to amplify campaigns. To your question, it may very well be surprising. I don't know if it's any more surprising than, say, the fact that TurboTax shares your information with Intuit, which is its holding company, or that the Starwood Hotel Groups has multiple brands and they share, or that Disney owns Hulu. Do you know that? Most people don't know that Disney owns Hulu, right? So then the question becomes, what is the utility of that information being available across multiple properties that an individual may not have knowledge of being shared? And how do you balance that against any potential risk, question A? And then question B, how do you ensure that the individual has access to that information? And if, depending on which rights you want to assess to it, has the right to delete or correct information that might be incorrect. So I think that that the complexity of the ecosystem is such that we do, while notice and choice will remain a component of any privacy bill, we shouldn't be limited to the notice and choice paradigm, but think about a new paradigm around what are commonly accepted obligations for stewardship, what are commonly accepted and prohibited uses of information, and how do we elevate the capacity of our consumer protection agencies to have both the expertise, resources, and power necessary to enforce those rights.
Yeah, and Tim, feel free to jump in here too. Do you agree?
Yeah, I mean, I want to push back on this idea of the stewardship, or there's accountability, or ethics came up as an idea earlier, or self-regulation, or even this idea of of being a fiduciary, right? It's like, trust us to do the right thing. I think on behalf of consumer advocates everywhere, I think we don't have a lot of confidence in this model. I mean, corporations exist to make money, and I don't mean that as a bad thing at all. Wall Street greed is good. That's their role in life. Unless we want to get away from the Milton Friedman concept of they exist for that purpose and that purpose alone, unless we want to adopt some of Elizabeth Warren's governance changes, I don't think we can reasonably expect companies to put societal externalities ahead of their business interests. And if we're not, then I don't think we can reasonably rely upon ethics or accountability to do the heavy lifting to reasonably safeguard consumer expectations.
That wasn't a presentation of what I just said, right?
It's a presentation of things I have heard. Well, you use the word stewardship, right? And maybe responding a little bit to Trevor's use of ethics in the previous panel, and some of Sheila's comments about about accountability. So yes, a little bit to you, but to kind of more general the conversation.
Okay, so then let me clarify.
Please.
Right. So what I said is that the end effect of a law should be to ensure that the users, those of us who are able to access people's information, have stewardship responsibilities. And those stewardship responsibilities would not be trust us to do whatever we want with your data or just trust us to self-govern or self-regulate, but rather that there should be a law. And that law should have obligations associated with your access to that information. And that there should be a strong agency with the resources and expertise necessary to enforce that law. So that's far from saying trust us or self-regulation. I mean, we are well past that conversation, and that's fine. I agree. I agree with I've never been an adherent to Milton Friedman. Worked for Barbara Boxer, John Kerry, and Barack Obama. I don't think that we would. And all of that aside, the point being that we are all agreed. I think that there's a general consensus today across those of us who have worked in this field for a very long time and represent multiple stakeholder interests, that it is time for a modernization of law, that law should be strong and that it should apply to all market actors. There's no difference of opinion there.
So I mean, there are like a lot of models out there that put a lot of the onus on having a privacy program, right? There's no actual rules in place, but to behave
but who here is
smartly.
advocating
We like
for
the
that?
Washington State privacy bill, the Intel draft privacy bill, put a lot of the and like thinking some of what Trevor was saying, like, you know, we got this. Don't worry about it. Putting the process of requiring you to think about privacy ahead of the need for strong, clear limitations on what you can do. And so, within whatever framework, yes, people should be internally trained. They should be smart. They should do the right thing. There should be consequences for violating the law. But I don't want this concept of having a privacy program to supersede the really more important discussion about clear rules and consequences for violating them.
Sure.
All right.
I think we can agree
Awesome.
on that.
I'm going to jump in and say I agree. I think the idea about stewardship and accountability is it is a new day. Companies realize that in order to have the right to use data robustly to create benefit and value and be a sustainable ongoing enterprise into the digital future, they have to take responsibility and they have to design with the person in the center. This is this notion of human-centered design ethic or data ethic, where it's not just about being a profiteer, it's about data should serve people. I think that we know this. I also agree that you've got to have a well-staffed, well-resourced, well-trained, strong enforcement construct as a part of any law. But I really worry about this sort of rear view mirror notion of bright lining. We're going to stop data flow here and stop data flow there, because the ability to think with data, to innovate with data, for the flow of digital to actually exist, we have to enable that and not artificially trying to chop that up because we don't trust business. We have to give a construct that charges business with being good stewards and with being accountable so that the market can operate in a very healthy, trustworthy manner. And there's always going to be a place for transparency, better, different, newer, modern transparency that's effective for people and those choices and those other controls. And we can decide what all of those are. But I think it comes with this, we're at a new point in time where we've got to have a law that matches the reality of the marketplace and lets the data-driven digital marketplace work, again, in a trustworthy manner. And I think it gets back to charging those of us that collect and use data with accountability obligations, with program obligations, with stewardship obligations that's inspectable, demonstrable, and enforceable.
So to play devil's advocate a little bit on that, it sounds like what you're saying is that we need a federal law that accommodates the current industry as it currently stands. And I think Justin's nodding his head, that's likely objectionable to a lot of consumer advocates who are unhappy with the current status quo, right? And I want to cite that in my view, there's been a tremendous impact of a book published about 6 months ago by Shoshana Zuboff at Harvard, who wrote a little bit about what you're talking about the economic logic that leads to increasing levels of data collection when you combine technology with capitalism. If you were to create bright line rules, they would have to be, at the point of data collection, linked to either consent, which we've seen it has all of its faults, right? Or some kind of balancing of risks and benefits, or some kind of hook to consumer expectations and context. So whichever of those three you choose, or maybe some combination of all of them, aren't all of those hooks going to in some way diminish the status quo industry as it exists by eliminating many of the sources of data collection?
So I'll be clear, I'm not advocating status quo. I'm not asking for a law that codifies exactly how we're operating today. I'm trying to operate in my enterprise well ahead of the law. The fourth pillar of the company I work for is data stewardship. So we're designing in all sorts of privacy capabilities, control capabilities, transparency capabilities into the way the engineering is designed, functioned, stood up, and deployed, because we want to preserve and have an outsized impact on our ecosystem, again, to create this accountability where data's understood, it's under control, it's used for good purpose, there's all the other rights attendant. So we want to have legal certainty and a trustworthy marketplace, so we need a modern law that does it. And remember, we've talked about this several times, data use is highly contextual. You have sensitive pieces of data, you have sensitive uses of data, and the big elephant on the table, in my view, is advanced computing. These machine learning, deep neural nets, the different kinds of AI agents that are coming online quicker and quicker and quicker. We've got a great deal of work ahead of us, and we need a modern law as soon as we can get one that lets the marketplace thrive, that again creates this certainty and accountability with the rights that are variable and contextual across these different uses. An example of that would be the very first privacy law in the United States, one that's worked very well. It hails from the early 70s, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is a data use law, and it's accountability based. And it's what provided our credit economy and fueled the ability for all of us to have access to credit. So very important construct, data use in context when there is a more material use of data with a material outcome. I think we need more rigor. But for other uses that are not, I would deem material, maybe the control mechanisms and the flow construct is a little bit different.
So let's talk about amending FICRA. I think that's a good place to start off with possible legislative solutions here. Tim, I'll turn to you. Before I do, just to follow on this, in our last panel, Amy Stepanovich, I thought, made a very compelling case that we should not be making distinctions any longer between sensitive and non-sensitive data. But a lot of the examples that you rose have to do with very, very sensitive topics, and it's clear that there should be some limitations on things like that. Did you agree with Amy? Should there be any distinction in law between sensitive and non-sensitive?
Yeah, the distinction between sensitive and non-sensitive data is nonsensical, and Amy's exactly right. LaTanya Sweeney proved this out 20 years ago. She's a professor at Harvard. The linkage of data makes any piece of data that we have about you able to unlock virtually any other piece of data about you. So the idea that the one piece of data is somehow per se more sensitive, whether it's financial or medical, doesn't really matter, is an anachronistic notion that is 60 years dead and gone. And we should get rid of it because it arose 60 years ago with our initial privacy laws around the world and the first iteration of the Fair Information Practice Principles, which was a good idea at the time, but we went on a wrong path. And what has turned out to be the case is that, in fact, because of the ubiquity of data, because of the data broker industry, the idea that a piece of data is somehow more sensitive or less sensitive doesn't make any more sense at all. We should get rid of that notion. I do think what we're having a problem with here is that we have a series of ethical problems and we don't have laws that are mapped up well to them. And we're talking about ethical issues and we're talking about them in the privacy context. So we have a series of things that are happening to consumers which are unfair, they are oftentimes unjustified. And we're ending up in a situation where consumers are being forced into a false choice, which is either they get the benefits of technology or they don't. And if they get the benefits of the technology, they also get all the burdens. And that's not how it should be, and that's not how it has to be. So I believe that we are smart enough in this day and age, in this country, to enact a set of laws and principles that allow us to have all of the benefits, amazing benefits of technology and of data brokerage, because there are lots of amazing things that can be done with data brokerage and lots of really important beneficial uses that responsible companies can bring to the marketplace. And I think that we can make this all come together. And one of the models that I think is the best model is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I think it is and remains our best, it has been and remains our best privacy law. In effect, it puts basic limitations on the use of certain data and reporting about individuals, and it lays out a series of ethical questions which say, largely, should these things be reported about people? If the data is erroneous about people, should the individual have a right to do something about it? And what happens when erroneous data is used to make an inappropriate decision about somebody, or whether it's appropriate or whether it's accurate or not, it ends up with a terrible consequence. What are we going to do to roll that back? Right? And that's what the Fair Credit Reporting Act structure does, and it has stood the test of time. And so if it's me and I'm writing the privacy law, I'm not trying to write a big omnibus privacy law, because I think that's an enormous lift. What I want to do is take this Fair Credit Reporting Act and expand it out and its concepts into, to take out these issues of data scoring that are inappropriate, to draw boundaries around types of scoring that should never be done, and to find ways to roll back unjustified outcomes for consumers. I think it's an easy thing to do. I think you can write that bill in 2 pages. And I think we could pass that act pretty darn quickly. And I think it would be a huge step forward for most consumers. And I think most businesses would benefit from it, because I think they'd have clear, bright lines from which to work that wouldn't interrupt with their business models. It would allow them to link data when they need to, and to continue to provide great services that we all want. So I think that would be a win-win. But I'm an optimist.
I mean, I'm a huge fan of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, and I'm glad we're all on the same page there. I think it could be tweaked narrowly to kind of more clearly get to some of the more aggressive use cases that people aren't really clear of. There was a really exhaustive complaint filed with the Federal Trade Commission earlier this week by a group whose name is escaping me, but kind of laying out a lot of these consumer scores about how people will use these secret scores to deny people the right to return products and deny service. I think that probably should fall within the Fair Credit Reporting Act. I'm not entirely sure. It clearly does, so making that more clear. I don't know how the Fair Credit Reporting Act would apply to advertising, though. I mean, there should be blanket, unlimited collection and retain it for 7 years, no real control around it, no real use limitation around it except for the stated purpose. And you can only contest, well, no, actually, I really like raspberries instead of blueberries. I don't think that model works. I think it actually makes, and I don't know that's what you're saying, but again, going back, I mean, I think for what Sheila referred to as kind of more, immaterial, not as consequential as FCRA, I think we can justify the law enforcing context, right? Axiom shouldn't know that what I bought at Whole Foods. Google shouldn't know what I do on WebMD. Whatever we've done today to try to get a meeting of the minds on this hasn't worked. And self-regulation, ethics, whatever, all those words, aren't sufficient today. So I think we do, again, after 20, however many years, need bright lines to address these issues.
Chime in on anything?
I think there's a practicality challenge, especially when you go beyond the material uses that the FCRA contemplates, of course. FCRA contemplates, it's a use law, and it says any data used in whole or in part to determine a person's credit capacity, eligibility, or standing is a credit report. So it really binds. If you use data for that determination, then it invokes all the obligations that come with it, and I think that's pretty good. But in the United States, we've come at other very material uses of data or sensitive, and I think there are certainly like my detailed health diagnostic data that results from a visit to my doctor is very consequential and very sensitive, at least to me. And so it's protected under a very thoughtful law and HIPAA. And I think we've decided as a culture that we recognize that there are certain classes of data and uses of data that are more sensitive than others. I think advertising and marketing, it's taken a lot of heat, fairly, unfairly. I think there have been a few bad actors that have created some blowback for the rest of us that try very hard every day to get it right and to contribute to a very important financial engine for the internet, for free content, free access. I think without the ad-supported model, I think the most socioeconomically challenged populations among us would be the ones that were injured the most. So, I think, again, it's a very complex debate. I think data is inevitable. We are in the digital age. We're going to accelerate. I think there's a bigger conversation to have around advanced analytics, advanced computing algorithms that we also need to pull into this debate, because that is a new challenge for all of us, and we need to think deeply about that. But we live in a vibrant digital time driven with data. It's an inevitability. Just quickly, by show of hands, how many people have more than one smart device on them today? How many people have a smart TV at home? How many people have a wearable, a watch, a shirt, a bra, some shoes? How many have bought a vehicle in the last, let's say, 36 months? Smart vehicle. What about smart cameras, smart thermostat? I mean, I've got all that, and I want it to all work. I want my tech to work. For that to work, data's got to flow. Smart medicine, one of mine, and I see Stan Crosley here.
But how many want Axiom to collect all that data together, or dozens of other companies?
So exactly what Sheila's describing is a lot of the economic logic behind a lot of these companies, because the problem is that advertisers can no longer attribute or measure the effectiveness of advertising when it takes place across different platforms. There's no easy way to know that you looked at an advertisement on your phone and then purchased that thing on your device, when 10 years ago it might have been very easy to know with relatively minimal tracking. And that's a lot of the push behind this, which I think you're describing. You wanted to react?
So what you were just talking about is the attribution challenge, and it's a huge challenge, and we actually partner with LiveRamp on cross-device solutions to many of those things. So, but I really don't think we're that far apart as a panel. I don't know if a 2-page expansion of the FCRA would solve the problem, but they're definitely, and I think if you're looking to legislation right now, there's a core group of members of the Senate Commerce Committee who have not yet produced a consensus draft, but that will be the primary vehicle if there is one. And I think it will take ideas and lessons from existing law, including the FCRA, probably some guidance from what the Europeans have done and some of what the Californians have done, and hopefully add some new ideas of their own. But I believe that that's going to be sort of the moving vehicle. And as it relates to advertising, we're a programmatic advertiser. And what does that mean? That means that we automate the process by which an advertisement goes from an advertiser to be put in front of a consumer. That process doesn't have to be personalized. The idea that you can do that in a contextual framework. We do it in a personalized framework, and we do it in a contextualized framework, and advertisers use a mix of both of those. Personalized tends to be more effective as a matter of return on investment. Mm-hmm. And we want to be able to continue to ensure that our advertisers are reaching consumers that want to use their products, and that those products are relevant to them. And that kind of frictionless action in the economy is really, really healthy for the economy.
So we're going to turn to questions for the last 10, 12 minutes. I'll just react to that as people think of their questions and raise their hands with a couple of thoughts on this. First, Justin, I think you seem to think the panel is much farther apart than Danny does, and that's pretty interesting. And two, with respect to why, Sheila, you mentioned these industries get so much of the bulk of privacy scrutiny, my reaction to that is that there are two big reasons why this comes up. And one is that I think most people don't see the immediate benefit of this kind of information sharing. Maybe I have slightly more personalized advertisements. But on the other, maybe I have free content, which I think we should not underestimate. But it's clear that there are huge values to advertisers. It's clear that there are huge, huge values to advertisers. And the second is that I think there is right now, with the rise of the Internet of Things, an increasing concern over the economic drivers. If we translate the online tracking ecosystem and the logic behind it to the offline world, then there is no logical endpoint to the type of data from private life within your home, within your car, that would not be valuable to advertisers or to data brokers, right? And I think that poses a problem for a lot of people. Let's take some questions. Cam, obviously the first one's going to go to you.
So thank you. Great panel. I want to pick a little bit more at this, the nub of the issue that Stacy identified. That how do you change the status quo, and what's the implications of that? So Sheila, you agreed with what Tim said, that there were just some atrocious lists out there. So if you think of this big grid behind you as a quadrant, so the upper right is the high social utility and high privacy uses. So let's say that data collection hashtag is maybe medical research. So there are going to be some things down on the lower left quadrant that may go away. I don't know, Angry Birds. Things that exist mainly to collect and sell data.
Flashlight apps that track your geolocation.
Sure. Talk about where some of those lines are. How does the status quo change? What does that lower left quadrant look like?
Tim?
Cam, I don't know if this is a direct answer to your question, but I think one of the things that could be done, irrespective of where the utility of data lands on your grid system, is that we could import a concept which I think is at the heart of the sentiment behind the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which is that there should be some notion of due process brought into the corporate world on behalf of consumers, right? If there is a bargain that is being struck between a business and a consumer, and data is the calculus by which much of that decision is being made, oftentimes for the benefit of the consumer, but certainly for the benefit of the business, when there is an error, and there will be errors, what are we going to do to unwind it? And so I want to see businesses take on a process where they voluntarily, or if they don't voluntarily, the Congress decides to enact a law that imposes upon them a system where there is a way to get mistakes undone. And so I think that the question about utility can be resolved either with a high utility or low utility, because there are going to be errors in both directions. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Shouldn't there be somebody to answer the darn phone or an email or a Slack message when something is erroneous that's been done with your data? I would think that is like part and parcel of the data age, because we should get all the benefits and we should be able to undo all the mistakes real fast. That to my mind is where the world should go. It's not a direct answer to your question, though.
Briefly?
Yeah.
Yeah, obviously from my comments, I'm going to draw the line more to the right, I think, than I think a lot of other people on this panel. I don't just want to get to the most egregious cases, like the urban strugglers or whatever shows up on 60 Minutes. I think a lot of the quotidian day-to-day data sharing should be addressed as well. And this is what the GDPR was designed to get to, and who knows, may one day still get to, if regulators in Europe actually want to address that. But I think the way to do it would again be to prohibit. If you want to take there are efforts to do a more light touch way, which is opt out, which is like the CCPA. How do you opt-outs to be meaningful need to be nuclear. They forgot to write that part of CCPA, though now they're alleging they kind of did. Do not track was obviously designed to address that. For those of us who really care, there needs to be one easy setting. I think there are thoughtful ways to do that. I think the Wyden bill in the Senate is actually really thoughtful. I don't agree with all of it, but I think is if you want a more middle ground approach to it, to allow all the flowing, for people who don't opt out. But I do think that this is contrary to most people's desires and expectations. And I think that ultimately most people would take advantage of that. So I think you'll end up in the same place.
I would commend to you a speech that Mark Pritchard, the CMO of Procter & Gamble, gave maybe, I don't know, it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, on the need for a clean media supply chain. Advertisers care deeply about the context in which their ads are landing. They care deeply about ensuring that the consumer with whom they want to have a relationship over time feels respected in that process. And they demand from us, from our company and companies like Sheilas, who are part of the middleware between them and the consumer, to provide an addressable and accountable mechanism by which they know that they are reaching the consumer in a way that's respectful, and the consumer knows that they're being reached in a way that's respectful. So to the degree that we move toward and out of the bucket here, I think, and that takes out of the ecosystem either dirty supply or dirty tech or bad actors, I think that most of the business community is going to be happy to support that kind of activity.
I'll echo that. I'll say, having worked in the data industry for over 2 decades, and yes, being a part and a strong advocate for co-regulation, industry code, self-regulation, and aggressively enforcing it well ahead of law, because as Trevor said on the prior panel, law sort of drags along. But we always tried to get it right. We wanted to get rid of the dirty. We were serving brands that wanted us to be accountable, wanted to be able to trust that we knew how to get it right. So we worked very hard, and we established rules that would keep our ecosystem safe, clean, trusted. We care deeply. We are trying very, very hard to get it right. Nobody likes the bad actors that have these lists that are insulting, undignified, embarrassed, biased, discriminatory. Nobody likes that. Nobody wants it. And so this pilgrimage through trying to self-regulate, codify, get better and better, stand up rigorous programs, choose trustworthy partners to create a clean supply chain. And now we're at this inflection point where it has come to a head, and we need a federal law. We need a federal law that lets the market work, again, in this trustworthy manner, and positions the American economy to operate in an interoperable way with the world.
We have about 4 minutes left, and I want to get through a number of questions, so I'm going to try this. Let's take 3 questions, and we'll direct them to individual people, and hopefully get through a couple in that fashion. So raise your hand if you have a question. We'll tag a couple. If it's only going to be Joe. All right. All right. Joe, why don't you start us off?
I'll try not to rant, but this came up in the first panel about the notion of enforcement and private rights of action, and a number of the people on this panel have already talked about meaningful, strong enforcement. And I just think it's been insightful to ask folks in different industries and different organizations, what do each of you think meaningful enforcement looks like? And because this is focused on advertising and data brokerage, do you think that meaningful enforcement exists in this industry?
Let's take one more question, and then we'll answer them. Yes, ma'am, right here.
And just to piggyback off that question as well, for meaningful enforcement, if it exists in the industry, how can it be improved in the industry, in your opinion?
And Alan. Can we get the microphone right here? 2 questions on enforcement. Yes, no to PRAs, and if not, what does enforcement look like? And?
So my question is a lot simpler. What are the problems we want to solve? And before we engage in a lot of very complex, be it 2 pages or 100 pages of legislation, let's identify the problems, because oftentimes in panels like these, we never talk about that. Now, Sheila just mentioned the embarrassing list, the discriminatory list. Obviously, that needs to be corrected. Everybody has blessed the Fair Credit Reporting Act. What's the problem there? That incorrect information could deny people jobs, insurance, employment, healthcare, et cetera. So, before you go about imposing a lot of legislation, regulation, identify the problems and solve that.
A risk-based approach, Alan?
Yes.
It's a great question. So I think that's for all of our panelists. We'll just start over with Justin. What's the number one problem we're trying to address, and how would you enforce?
Yeah, so I mean, I think people have legitimate interest in not having thousands of random third parties having detailed records about all the things they do. It could be breached, could be used to give them differential treatment that they don't want to. But it's also just a question of like autonomy. It's none of your business, right? I mean, going back to the fundamental discussion of the right to seclusion, the right to be left alone, the right to be unobserved, I think is a legitimate value people are concerned about, which is why people react so negatively to a lot of this industry's practices. Quickly, do you want to do enforcement now, or? Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think generally there's actually probably more agreement. A more robust FTC with maybe 3 times the resources, state AGs backing it up, and initial penalty authority. I do think echoing what Amy's echoing David Brody. I mean, I think private enforcement is going to be necessary. I mean, if you look at what's happening in Europe, ICO comes out with a report saying, "Oh, everyone's violating GDPR. We're not really going to do anything about it." I think just resting and waiting for regulators to do their job. I mean, look, if there are things that, if there are ways that the private right of action is unfair, then constrain them. But I think people should have a right to act to protect their own interests.
So we didn't even get to the ICO report. I should plug, if people are interested, there's a really excellent report published by the UK Information Commissioner's Office on Friday, exploring the legality under the GDPR of real-time bidding, which is a subset of programmatic advertising. Definitely something to check out.
I think we're trying to solve 2 problems to Alan's question. First, we have inaccurate results, and we have inaccurate scoring, which will lead to other inaccurate results. And then we have accurate but unjustified or unfair outcomes, and no means of resolving those. And I think we have to resolve both of those things with whatever law we try to enact. And then to the question of enforcement, having advised lots and lots of executives over the last couple of decades, I think the single biggest change that we could enact in order to change behavior would be to hold executives personally accountable. And the way I think that we could do that is something like Sarbanes-Oxley, where we ask for certifications from executives and we require them to actually go through the programs. I'm actually a huge fan of the Intel legislation, which forces a program and requires accountability. And I would like to see executives own what happens in their companies and annually certify to what's happening there and hold them responsible when there's deviation from those certifications materially.
Do you agree with Justin's point that the zone of privacy and autonomy itself is the violation, that that's the harm we're trying to address?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
So one thing that the law is designed to address is like people want to be left alone. People want to have people not know about them, right? I mean, like we've passed privacy laws in the past, like the Wiretap Act. Like, don't listen to my conversations. There's no like risk base. Well, what's the harm? Like it's like no, some assholes listening to my conversations, right? People have legitimate interest in caring about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, this is a real problem. It is a first order problem. I do not know how to resolve it. I'd like the Supreme Court to undo the third party doctrine in U.S. versus Miller, and that would take care of it in a heartbeat in my mind. So let's go do that.
I can get on board with that.
For the next court session, we can do that next year. So.
The core problems we're trying to solve, and how would you address enforcement?
Well, I want to echo what Danny said earlier. I don't know that we're that far apart. I'm a person, a human, a citizen of the United States, and I care deeply about these issues, not just for myself, but for my children. And I think it boils down into 3 buckets. And I think data is highly complex. Data uses are highly complex and becoming more every day. Data is infinite, and our challenges are this. We need rights of seclusion. So I want a place in the world where I can be a free and natural, unobserved human. I want some autonomy or agency, the ability to participate and be empowered, right? And then the third bucket or thing that we need to address, and this is where we really need to break some glass and devise modern legislation here in the United States, is this notion of fair processing and what it looks like for the digital age. Because, as I've said, data is inevitable and digital is a certainty, and it's only getting more complex every day. From an enforcement standpoint, I think that too is complex. Of course, we need an authority that's well-trained, well-resourced, well-funded, and I think we need more than just enforcement. I think we need oversight, sort of like the banking agencies. They they do spot checks, they give an opportunity to cure, and then they enforce. And so I think we need some of that in our enforcement strategy. For sure, we need a federal authority, and we likely need the help of the state attorneys general. I think they have a role to play. Specific to PRA, I think it comes with real challenges, especially for the small business person who can just literally, what was that case that was recently in the news about the Disabilities Act and the little coffee shop that literally had been there for whatever it was, 50, 60 years and was a landmark, and an opportunistic, trial attorney came after them, and they couldn't afford to close their doors. And that's not that uncommon. So, private rights of action, I think we have to really understand. Maybe the answer is not none. Maybe the answer is a private right has to be one person at a time, and you can't do these big, large classes that are just, as we know, having lived through this, big money makers for the trial bar, and the person in the class might get 50 cents, literally. So I think PRA is not a panacea. I think if we want to consider it because we can't staff or train our federal authority or our state AGs well enough, then I think we really have to get down to some granularity and be thoughtful about the unintended consequence that could devastate especially small and middle-sized firms that don't have the resources to withstand one of these big settlement negotiations. I think we have to be very careful.
Great. Thanks, Dave.
So my company is called Media Math because we wanted to apply math and logic and intelligence to what was a previously intuitive process by which an advertiser placed advertisements due to a relationship with a publisher and then hoped that they got a return on that investment. We're really trying to increase the efficiency in the marketplace. And that efficiency enables free services, and it enables marketers and businesses to provide services to people at cheaper rates than they otherwise would be able to. And so the harm that we're trying to prevent, if as we move forward, is to reduce or eliminate any exposure to harm that occurs through that process for individuals, and for those areas where there is a real risk to harm, where you are either using sensitive points of data or inferring sensitive points of data, and it exposes the person as a result to a greater risk of harm, then they should have a higher level of governance, right? And I think that's where the center of this debate is right now.
Okay, great. I think we're just at time, Cam, so we'll stop it there. Thanks so much to the panel.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.